It happened on a night wrapped in gold and pride. The fire glowed in the marble fireplace. The chandelier sparkled like frozen stars, and laughter filled every corner of my father's mansion. We were halfway through our luxury Christmas dinner when he leaned back in his chair, wineglass in hand, and said loudly enough for the whole table to hear, "Poor girl, still at that useless job, huh?" Everyone laughed. Their laughter hit me like 1,000 tiny knives until the man sitting beside him, his most important guest, rose from his seat and said calmly, "Please make way for the CEO." The room fell silent. My father's face went pale. The silence after those words felt heavier than all the glittering chandeliers above us. I watched my father's smirk dissolve into disbelief, the color draining from his cheeks. His VIP guest, Mr. Kent, the man whose company had just signed a multi-million-dollar partnership with mine, looked between us with quiet satisfaction. "I didn't realize you were her father," he said. "You must be proud." Proud. A word that had never quite fit between us. I should have felt triumphant. After all, I'd built RainTech from scratch, turned late-night coding sessions into an empire. Yet standing there, every memory of being dismissed, overlooked, or politely excluded flickered back like ghosts around the table. My success didn't erase the humiliation that had shaped me. It simply illuminated it under brighter lights. If you'd asked me 10 years ago what I wanted most, I would have said respect. From my father. From anyone. But respect, I learned, doesn't come when you beg for it. It comes when you no longer need it. And that lesson started long before this Christmas night. My name is Clara Reynolds. I'm 34 years old, and I never planned on coming back to Los Angeles for Christmas. The city of palm trees and glass towers had always been my father's stage, not mine. He was Richard Reynolds, the man who built half of West Hollywood's skyline, founder of Rain Construction, philanthropist, socialite, perfectionist. To everyone else, he was the American success story. To me, he was the man who could silence a room with a single disapproving glance. After my mother died when I was 11, silence became our family's native language. It filled the house, the dinners, the spaces where comfort should have lived. For a while, it was just him and me, awkward grieving, trying to figure out how to breathe through loss. Then came Diane. Diane arrived like a change in weather, polished calm with the kind of poise that made people straighten their backs around her. She was a widow with a teenage son, Ethan, and an air of competence that impressed everyone, especially my father. Within a year, she'd gone from the kind woman who brings casseroles to your new stepmother. I was 13. I didn't hate her, at least not right away. She smelled like vanilla and said all the right things, but small things shifted after the wedding. My bedroom moved from the second floor with the view of the city to the smaller guest room near the laundry. "It's quieter here," she told me. "Better for studying." At first I believed her. Then came the new family traditions. Her recipes replaced my mother's. Her ornaments covered the tree. Her son got the seat next to Dad at dinner. When I brought up old rituals, she smiled sweetly and said, "Change is part of growing, darling." By 16, I'd learned that invisibility was safer than confrontation. I buried myself in textbooks, coding tutorials, and part-time jobs. I built worlds inside computers because the real one never felt like mine. College became my escape route. I left home at 18, full scholarship to MIT, 2 suitcases, and a burning need to prove that I was more than the quiet girl in the wrong bedroom. Dad helped me move in, handed me an envelope with $500 and said, "Make me proud." It was the first time I'd heard him say that since Mom died. I tried. God, I tried. The first few years were brutal. Coffee at dawn, code until sunrise, and ramen nights that stretched into endless weekends. But I loved it. Every problem had a logic, every failure an equation I could fix. I built something that didn't depend on anyone's approval. By 28, I'd launched RainTech, a data analytics firm specializing in predictive consumer behavior. Investors laughed at first. Then one chain store tested our software and saw their customer retention jump 40%. Overnight, the useless job my father mocked became a multi-million-dollar company. But even success doesn't rewrite family scripts. For 5 years, I barely saw him. The few times I called, Diane answered. "Your father's busy," she'd say, or "We're at Ethan's engagement dinner." When I sent Forbes' 30 Under 30 issue with my name on the cover, she mailed it back with a sticky note. "We're so proud. But you shouldn't waste time on flattery from magazines." So when the invitation for the Reynolds family Christmas gala arrived printed on heavy embossed paper with gold lettering, I almost tossed it in the trash. Almost. But something inside me, call it curiosity, maybe unfinished business, made me keep it. Now as I looked around that grand dining room, I could see every inch of Diane's perfection. Crystal vases, polished cutlery, champagne bubbling like liquid gold. Her son Ethan sat to my father's right, discussing a new construction project he'd joined. My father nodded with approval. When I arrived earlier that evening, Diane greeted me with her trademark air kiss and said, "Oh, Clara, I wasn't sure you could make it. You must be so busy with—" What was it again? "Computers, data analytics," I corrected, smiling. "And yes, it's been a busy quarter." "Well," she said, gesturing toward the dining hall tonight, "let's keep it simple. Family only. Family only." The words echoed. At dinner, I tried to blend in, sipping wine, answering small talk. But beneath the table, my hands clenched. Every toast, every compliment toward Ethan's leadership potential reminded me of years of being unseen, until my father, warm from wine and attention, leaned back and decided to remind me where I came from. "Poor girl," he said with a chuckle. "Still at that useless job." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The laughter around me blurred into white noise. Then a voice cut through it, calm and clear. "Mr. Reynolds," said the man beside him, silver hair, confident posture. "I didn't realize your daughter was Clara Reynolds, CEO of Raintech." The table froze. Raintech. My father blinked. "Yes," the man continued. "We implemented her firm's software last quarter. 30% growth already. Brilliant work." He turned to me, smiling. "Madam CEO, it's an honor." Every eye at the table swung toward me. I forced a polite nod, though my pulse pounded in my ears. "Thank you," I said quietly. The silence that followed was exquisite. It wasn't the silence of exclusion anymore, it was recognition, and it burned brighter than any revenge I'd ever imagined. But standing there beneath the glow of gold and glass, I realized something. This wasn't a victory. Not yet. Because no title, no applause could rewrite the pain that had brought me here. That would come later. And it would start tonight. The morning after the dinner, Los Angeles looked deceptively peaceful. Sunlight spilled across the balcony of my hotel suite, glinting off the skyline like nothing had ever happened. The humiliation of last Christmas still echoed, the laughter, the silence, the shock on my father's face. I'd flown across the country for what I thought would be closure, but instead, it opened every wound I'd spent years burying under success. I poured coffee, the kind that tasted faintly metallic, and sat by the window. My phone buzzed emails from investors, a reminder for a virtual board meeting, a congratulatory message from my COO about our new contract. None of it mattered. I couldn't shake the image of my father's confused eyes as Mr. Kent called me Madam CEO. He didn't look proud. He'd looked stunned, maybe even embarrassed. The funny thing about humiliation is that it doesn't fade when you grow up, it mutates. When I was a kid, it came in whispers and small corrections. "Don't talk too loud, Clara. That's not how your mother used to do it." Later, it was disguised as politeness. "We're so glad you could make time for us, dear." Politeness became the cage I lived in. I thought success would break it. Instead, it only made the bars invisible. After breakfast, I drove west toward the coast, letting muscle memory guide me through the city I'd once called home. The further I went, the more the landscape changed, steel and glass giving way to familiar streets, small houses with palm trees leaning like tired sentinels. I hadn't been back to Brentwood in over 7 years. The old Reynolds house looked the same, though somehow smaller. The manicured lawn, the white columns, the fountain that never stopped running, it all felt frozen in time. I parked across the street and sat there for a long minute, staring at the front door where my father used to wait after school. Back then, he'd smile and ask about my day. After Diane, he'd still stand there, but the smiles were for her children. When he married Diane, I was 12. I remember her arrival like a movie scene, a woman in a soft blue dress, her son holding her hand, both of them glowing under the porch light. My father looked 10 years younger that night. I remember thinking maybe this was what happiness looked like, grown-up happiness. At first she was kind. She brought me hair ribbons, baked cookies, told me I was so bright, just like your father. But kindness, I learned, has conditions. The first Christmas after the wedding, she changed everything. Gone were the handmade ornaments my mom and I had painted together. In their place, metallic gold ones from a luxury store. When I asked about the old ones, she smiled. They didn't match the new theme, sweetheart. Dad said nothing. He never did. By 15, I had learned to survive by disappearing. I studied late, stayed out of sight, and built worlds inside computers, because the real one never felt like mine. Every small achievement I shared was politely acknowledged, then forgotten in the shadow of Ethan's soccer trophies or Diane's social charity events. Dad's approval, once effortless, became conditional. He started introducing me to his business associates as my daughter, the bookworm, while he introduced Ethan as the one who'll take over someday. The divide grew silently like ivy on a wall. One night I overheard them talking in the kitchen. Diane's voice was low but sharp. She needs to understand her place, Richard. Ethan looks up to you, and you can't keep splitting your attention. You know how fragile he is. She's just a kid, my father said. She's your kid, Diane corrected, not ours. I never forgot that word, ours. I left for college on a gray morning in June. My father hugged me quickly, slipped a small envelope into my hand, and said, "Make me proud." Diane waved from the car. Ethan didn't come out to say goodbye. I remember sitting on the bus, watching the house shrink until it was just a blur in the window, thinking, this is freedom. At MIT, I built a new version of myself, focused, ambitious, self-contained. I didn't party. I didn't date. I spent nights in the computer lab until the janitors turned off the lights. The pain of being unseen became fuel. I coded my way through grief, through anger, through loneliness. When I launched Rain Tech 6 years later, I didn't tell my family. I didn't want their validation. Or maybe I was just afraid they'd laugh. The irony was, the world noticed before they ever did. Then 3 months ago, a thick white envelope arrived at my office. The handwriting on it stopped me cold. Richard and Diane Reynolds request the honor of your presence at the Reynolds Family Christmas Gala. It wasn't an invitation, it was a test. Now sitting in my car outside that same house, I couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry. The luxury Christmas dinner had ended in an unexpected reckoning, and yet I wasn't sure who'd really won. My father's silence during the humiliation, his inability to defend or even recognize me, hurt more than Diane's condescension. I took out my phone, scrolled through old messages. One stood out, a single-line text from my father last year. "Proud of you, kiddo." It was sent after I'd been featured on Business Weekly. I hadn't replied. I'd been too busy, too numb, too tired of half-hearted words. Now I wished I had. A knock on my window startled me. Ethan stood outside, hands in his pockets. He looked older, wearier, but the same faint arrogance lingered. I rolled down the window. "Didn't expect to see you parked here," he said. "You're making the neighbors nervous." "I was just leaving," I replied. He leaned down. "Look about last night. Mom shouldn't have said what she did. And Dad, he just talks without thinking sometimes." "That's convenient," I said flatly. He sighed. "You know how they are. They don't mean to hurt you." I met his eyes. "They just do it anyway." He looked away, ashamed, or maybe just uncomfortable. "You're not coming by, are you?" "No. Probably for the best," he muttered. "Things are tense." When he walked back toward the house, I saw the porch light flicker on Diane watching from the doorway. She was still the queen of that empire, her crown invisible, but unshakable. I started the car and pulled away, heart pounding. The city swallowed the house in the rearview mirror. For the first time in years, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was just done. But as I turned onto Sunset Boulevard, a thought hit me hard enough to make me pull over. I'd spent my whole life trying not to need them, my father, Diane, Ethan. But what if I wasn't supposed to erase my past? What if the only way to heal it was to face it on my terms? Maybe that night's humiliation wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning. 2 weeks passed before I heard from my father again. The message came on a Sunday afternoon, tucked between a reminder from my assistant and a push notification about quarterly projections. "Clara, I'd like to see you. Dinner this Friday. Just us. No apology. No explanation. Just the same clipped tone he used when scheduling meetings." For hours I stared at that text. I told myself I didn't care that I was too busy running a company to dissect one message from a man who hadn't called in years. But the truth sat in my chest like an ember that refused to die. Part of me still wanted him to try. When Friday came, I drove to a quiet restaurant in Beverly Hills, his choice naturally. The kind of place with dim lighting, white tablecloths, and a wait list that required pedigree. He was already there when I arrived, sitting upright in his navy blazer, sipping his scotch with precision. "Clara," he said, rising just enough to seem polite. "You look well." "So do you?" I lied. He looked older, his posture bent slightly at the shoulders. Success doesn't stop time. It just hides it behind good tailoring. We sat in silence until the waiter left. He cleared his throat. "I suppose I owe you an explanation for what happened." "You suppose?" His jaw tightened. "It wasn't my intention to embarrass you." I folded my napkin slowly. "You didn't embarrass me, Dad. You embarrassed yourself." The words landed heavier than I meant them to, but I didn't take them back. For once he didn't argue. He just stared at his drink. "You've built something impressive," he said finally. "I didn't realize how successful you were. I sent you articles, invitations. You never asked." He winced. "Diane said you preferred privacy. Diane said I repeated my voice flat. You always let her speak for you." He sighed, running a hand over his graying hair. I thought keeping peace was better than picking sides. Peace for who I asked quietly. "You or her?" He didn't answer. The waiter brought our food, but neither of us touched it. Between us lay years of unspoken blame, heavy as the silverware. "You were always strong," he said finally. "I figured you didn't need me hovering." "That's not strength," I said. "That's survival." He looked at me, then really looked. For a flicker of a moment, I saw the father. I remembered the man who used to build model airplanes with me in the garage before everything fell apart. "Maybe I failed you," he said. "But I did what I thought was best." I smiled bitterly. That's what everyone who hurt someone says. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut through the room. When the check arrived, he paid without looking at me. "Christmas should have been different," he said. "I'll talk to Diane." "Don't bother," I said. "She'll just make it my fault anyway. The gesture is too little too late to salvage that wreckage." The following week, I threw myself into work. Rain Tech was in the middle of negotiating a new partnership with a European energy firm, and the intensity left little room for reflection. Yet every night when the office emptied and the city lights bled through the glass, the echoes of that silent dinner still reminded me why I was running and what I was running from. He wasn't wrong. But failure was too easy a word for what happened. He hadn't just failed me, he'd chosen comfort over confrontation, silence over protection. And silence, I'd learned, was its own kind of betrayal. Still, the ember in my chest refused to die. It was a Wednesday night when the second invitation came, this time from Diane herself. The email was short, formal, and oddly cautious. "Richard would like to host a small family dinner this weekend. He'd appreciate it if you joined us. No guests, no press. Just family." I almost deleted it. But something in her phrasing, "he'd appreciate it," felt less like manipulation and more like surrender. I replied with one word, "Fine." Saturday arrived cold and gray. When I pulled into the familiar driveway, the house looked unchanged, impeccable, sterile, silent. But as soon as I stepped inside, I noticed subtle differences. The grandeur had softened. No caterers, no champagne pyramids, just a dining table set for 4. Diane appeared from the kitchen, her composure as perfect as ever, but her eyes carried something new unease. "Clara," she said, her voice even. "Thank you for coming." I nodded. "You said no press." "That's a start." Her lips twitched at the corner, almost a smile, almost not. "We thought it might be time to reset. After what happened, because of what happened," she said quietly. Dad entered, then carrying a serving dish. "Dinner's simple tonight," he said. "Homemade." I almost laughed. The man who'd once hired private chefs for Sunday brunch was now setting down roasted chicken and potatoes. Diane caught my expression. "He insisted," she said. "Said he wanted to do something real." "Real," I echoed. "That's new." We sat. The first few minutes were awkward forks clinking polite conversation about weather and business. Then Dad looked at me across the table. "You said I let Diane speak for me," he began. "You're right. I did. But that stops now." Diane's fork paused mid-air. He turned to her. "I spent years mistaking quiet for peace. But peace built on silence isn't peace at all. It's surrender." She blinked, her composure cracking slightly. "Richard, this isn't—" "It is," he said firmly. "I should have stood up for Clara. I didn't. That's on me." For the first time in years, I saw my stepmother speechless. Dad turned back to me. "You deserved better than what we gave you. I can't change the past, but I can stop pretending it didn't happen." I didn't know what to say. Apologies weren't his language. The rawness in his voice startled me. My eyes stung. That was the apology I had yearned for since I was 13, and it brought not satisfaction, but a deep, sorrowful grief for the years we had lost. Finally, I said, "Acknowledging it is a start." He nodded. "Then let's start there." After dinner, Diane asked if I wanted tea. Her tone wasn't warm, but it wasn't sharp either. We stood in the kitchen, the same room where she'd once told my father I didn't belong. She handed me a cup and said, "You know I didn't mean for that Christmas dinner to go that way." "Yes, you did," I said gently. "You've meant it for 20 years. Last night just made it obvious." She looked down, fingers tightening on her teacup. "You're not wrong," she whispered. "I was jealous of you, of how much he loved you. I thought if I made you smaller, there'd be more space for me." Her honesty startled me more than any insult could have. I set my teacup down, meeting her gaze. "I understand the pain, Diane," I said, my voice measured, "but that doesn't excuse the damage. You chose to make everything cold." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "No, it just made everything colder." When I left that night, the sky had cleared. The house behind me glowed softly through the windows, not grand, not perfect, but human. For the first time, I felt like maybe the story wasn't over. Maybe, just maybe, it was finally beginning to change. The morning after that dinner, I woke up in my apartment to the smell of rain and the weight of memory. Los Angeles rarely looked soft, but through the gray haze, even the skyline seemed quieter, almost forgiving. I sat at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee and my laptop open, but my mind wasn't on work. It was stuck back in that house on Maple Drive, the house where I'd learned to make myself small enough to survive. The night had ended without drama, no raised voices, no slammed doors. Just 4 people sitting around a table pretending to be a family, each of us unsure what to do with the silence that followed the first real apology my father had ever spoken. But apologies, I've learned, don't erase ghosts. They wake them. By noon, I gave up on work and found myself driving again, no destination, just motion. Somehow I ended up near Brentwood, a few streets away from where I'd grown up. I pulled to the curb, shutting off the engine, and finally stepped out of the car. The damp air was sharp, and I instinctively touched the rusted iron gate of the nearest house, grounding myself. I sat there for a while, watching families walk dogs and kids ride scooters on the wet pavement. I told myself I was only passing through, that nostalgia was a waste of time. But the truth was, part of me wanted to see that house again, not the marble version of success my father built later, but the one before Diane. The little blue 2-story with the peeling shutters and creaky steps. The house my mother had filled with sunlight, laughter, and cinnamon rolls. I didn't realize I'd driven there until I saw it 324 Maple Drive. The paint was different now, white instead of blue, but the shape of the front porch was the same. A woman I didn't know came out carrying a toddler. She smiled politely the way strangers do, unaware that she was standing in my entire childhood. As she walked past my car, she paused. "Aren't you Richard Reynolds' daughter?" she asked, her voice laced with neighborhood curiosity. "I remember your mother. Such a lovely woman." The unexpected mention of my mother by a stranger hit me with a jolt of real emotion. For a second, I almost got out of the car, almost knocked on the door. But what would I have said? "Hi, sorry to bother you?" I just needed to see the last place I remember feeling loved. Instead, I just sat there gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. It wasn't just a house, it was proof of what used to be true. My phone rang, breaking the trance. It was Ethan. "Hey," he said, his voice cautious. "Dad told me you came for dinner." I did. "How was it?" Awkward, I said. "But be honest." He hesitated. "Mom's been quiet since then." "That's not like her. Maybe that's a good thing." He gave a soft laugh. "Yeah, maybe. Look, I know we've never been close. But, I don't know, I've been thinking about how weird it must have been for you back then. Moving in, everything changes. Weird is one word for it." He sighed. "I was a kid. I just went along with whatever Mom said. I didn't realize—" "You don't have to explain," I interrupted. "You were doing what made sense for you." Still, he said, "I'm sorry. I should have done better." The apology caught me off guard. Ethan had always been the golden boy, Diane's mirror image, confident, adored, untouchable. Hearing regret in his voice was something new. "Thanks," I said quietly. There was a pause, then he added, "Mom wants to invite you for Christmas Eve. Small gathering this time. She said she'd like to make things right." I almost laughed. Her version of small usually involves professional lighting. Not this year. Dad's insisting on simple. Just family. The words hung between us. Just family. The phrase used to sting. Now it felt like a test. "I'll think about it," I said. That night I couldn't sleep. The city outside my window shimmered with neon, but all I could see was that white house on Maple Drive. I remembered my mother's handwriting on the note she left in my lunchbox every day. "Be kind, even when it's hard." Maybe that's what this was about, not revenge, not proving anything but kindness, the kind that requires strength. The next morning I called my father. "I'll come for Christmas," I said. He didn't hide the surprise in his voice. "You will?" "Yes. But no photographers, no charity guests, no reporters. If Diane wants to fix things, it has to start at home." He paused. "She agreed to that already. Then I guess I'll see you on Christmas Eve." When I hung up, I realized my hands were trembling. Not from fear. From the knowledge that walking back into that house wasn't about the past. It was about reclaiming the version of myself that had lived there once. Christmas Eve arrived faster than I expected. The city glowed under a rare December drizzle, palm trees strung with white lights. I drove slowly through the old neighborhoods, the radio playing carols I hadn't listened to since I was a kid. When I turned onto Maple Drive again, my chest tightened. The house looked almost the same as last week, immaculate, proud, but something was different. The front door stood open, light spilling onto the driveway. My father met me there holding a tray of candles. "You made it," he said simply. I nodded. Traffic was light. Inside, the air smelled of pine and cinnamon. No glittering decorations this time, just a small tree with simple ornaments. On the mantel between framed photos of Ethan's family and my father's company awards was a single new picture, me shaking hands with a senator at an award ceremony. I recognized it from a magazine. "You put that there?" I asked. "Diane did," he said. Before I could respond, she appeared from the kitchen. "No diamonds tonight. Just a plain burgundy sweater, her hair pulled back." "Merry Christmas, Clara," she said softly. "I thought we could try again." For the first time, I didn't feel the instinct to brace myself. So did I. We stood there for a long moment, the air thick with all the words we hadn't said. Then Ethan burst in carrying a box of candles. "Dad, you forgot the lighter," he said, then smiled at me. Clara, glad you came. I smiled back. Me too. The three of them moved around me, awkwardly, uncertainly, but together. The house felt different now, warmer somehow, as if it was exhaling after years of holding its breath. As we sat down to dinner, I glanced at the empty chair across from me. The one my mother used to fill. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel its absence as pain. I felt it as a presence, and I knew this Christmas would not end like the last. The rain had stopped by the time the first guest arrived. I watched through the living room window as headlights swept across the driveway, followed by the sound of laughter, warm, rehearsed, and expensive. It wasn't supposed to be a party, but Diane never did anything halfway. Just family, she'd said. But to Diane Reynolds, family always seemed to include half of Los Angeles society. Inside the table gleamed under soft gold lighting. A centerpiece of white lilies stretched the length of it, surrounded by candles that flickered against the polished silverware. Every plate was perfectly placed, every glass aligned, as if symmetry could hold the illusion of peace. I stood at the edge of the room, adjusting the sleeve of my emerald dress. I'd worn it deliberately. It was elegant, understated, powerful. The same color I'd worn at the awards ceremony, when Raintech had been recognized as one of the fastest-growing AI firms in North America. Back then, my father hadn't called. Tonight, he'd asked me to come early. Progress, I told myself. Diane appeared beside me, her perfume faint but precise. "You look lovely," she said. "So do you," I replied. Her eyes flicked to my dress. "That's the same color you wore in that article photo, isn't it?" I smiled. "You read it, of course." Everyone did. Her smile was tight. "You've built quite the reputation." Reputation. Not success. Not an achievement. Just something to discuss over cocktails. "Let's hope dinner lives up to it," I said, my voice cool. My father entered the room, carrying a decanter of wine. "Everyone ready?" he asked. He looked lighter somehow, less burdened than before. His attempt at peace had softened his edges. But as the doorbell chimed again and guests began to filter in, old colleagues, family friends, a few names from the local business scene, his shoulders straightened, the old tension creeping back. Richard, a man's booming voice, filled the foyer, still hosting the best dinners in town. It was him, Walter Kent, CEO of Kent Holdings, one of my father's most important partners. I recognized him instantly. His company had recently licensed one of Raintech's AI platforms. "Walt," my father said, shaking his hand. "Glad you could make it." Diane glided over with her hostess smile. "Walter, this is my stepdaughter Clara." Walter's gaze flicked toward me, and for a second his eyes widened with recognition. Clara Reynolds. Of Raintech. "The same," I said, shaking his hand. "Well, I'll be damned," he said with a grin. "Your software changed the way my company handles logistics. Didn't expect to meet the genius behind it at a Christmas dinner." Diane's smile faltered. My father's face went stiff. He looked at Diane, visibly unsure how to handle the sudden public connection. "Professionally," Walter said. "Her firm's revolutionizing half the industry." He turned to me. "Didn't realize you were Richard's daughter." "Small world. Smaller than you think," I said. The room went quiet for a heartbeat long enough for Diane to interject. "Richard, perhaps you can show Walter the new wine cellar." My father hesitated, but Walter laughed. "Later. I want to hear more about this one's work." He gestured toward me. "Not tonight," Diane said lightly. "We're here to relax." Walter gave her a polite smile but didn't look away from me. "You don't get to relax when you're running a company like hers, do you?" "No," I said, holding his gaze. "You just learn to hide the exhaustion behind better lighting." He laughed, the kind of full approving laugh men reserve for other executives. "I like you," he said. "You remind me of myself 30 years ago." Across the table, my father's expression flickered pride, surprise, and something else I couldn't quite read. Dinner began. The conversation flowed easily between guests, though tension hummed beneath the surface. Diane maintained her perfect hostess act, refilling glasses, laughing on cue. But her gaze kept darting toward me, calculating. "So Walter said midway through the meal, Richard tells me your company's expanding overseas." I set down my fork. We're opening an R&D branch in Singapore next quarter, focused on ethical AI integration. Impressive, he said. You're setting new standards for transparency. Most companies wouldn't bother. My father looked uncomfortable. Clara's always been ambitious, he said, his tone light. Diane added quickly, sometimes to a fault. There it was, the casual jab. I saw Diane's fingers sipping her wine glass, a visible tremor beneath her practiced calm. I smiled. Ambition's not a fault when it's backed by results. Walter chuckled. Well said. The others laughed politely, but my father stayed quiet. He'd always hated public conflict, even the subtle kind. Then, as if she couldn't help herself, Diane leaned toward me. You must miss having time for personal things, relationships, family. Success like that doesn't leave much room for anything else, does it? It was bait thinly veiled as sympathy. I looked her straight in the eye. You're right. It doesn't. But that's the difference between building something that lasts and spending your life polishing what someone else built. The table went silent. A few guests coughed into their napkins. My father's knife froze mid-air. Diane's face stiffened the faintest crack in her practiced calm. Well, she said, her voice sweet as sugar. Not everyone wants to live at work. Not everyone has the luxury of pretending their work doesn't define them, I replied softly. Walter raised his glass. To the women who do the defining, he said, breaking the tension with a grin. Laughter returned, uneasy but genuine. My father's eyes met mine across the table. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. After dessert, Diane excused herself to the kitchen. The guests began drifting toward the living room, chatting in low tones. I stepped outside for air, the night cool against my skin. Moments later, my father joined me. You didn't have to embarrass her, he said quietly. She started it, I said. She always does. But you're better than that. I turned to face him. Better or quieter? He sighed. You think I don't see what she does? I just did nothing. I finished for him. He flinched. I softened. I didn't come here to fight, Dad. I came because you asked me to. Seeing you avoid this confrontation the same way you avoided defending me for years reminds me why I left. He looked down, hands in his pockets. I wanted one normal Christmas. But maybe normal doesn't exist for us anymore. Maybe it never did, I said. We stood in silence for a while, the hum of distant laughter filtering through the windows. Inside, I could see Diane moving between guests. Her smile restored, her control reasserted. But something had changed. For the first time, the room didn't belong to her. Walter Kent's voice rose above the noise. Clara, come back in here. I was telling them about your latest project. I caught my father's eye. He gave a small nod, half pride, half resignation. And for the first time that evening, I walked back inside, not as the forgotten daughter, but as the woman everyone finally had to see. The guests left just after midnight. The laughter faded, the clinking glasses stopped, and the house grew heavy with that strange stillness that follows the performance. My father stood at the door, shaking hands, Diane beside him in her sequined dress that caught the light even when her smile didn't. I lingered by the hallway, unsure whether to slip away or stay for the unspoken reckoning waiting beneath the quiet. When the last car pulled out of the driveway, Diane turned and began collecting empty glasses, her movements brisk and brittle. That went well, she said, though her tone was razor thin. Better than last year, my father said, hanging up his jacket. Barely, she muttered. Walter Kent practically made her the guest of honor. She earned it, my father said simply. Diane froze her back to him. Excuse me? Her company. Her success. She earned it, he repeated. There's no shame in people recognizing that. Her hands tightened around a crystal flute until I half expected it to shatter. No shame, she said quietly. Richard, she turned this evening into a showcase. You saw how everyone fawned over her, how small that made you look. I stepped forward from the shadows. I didn't make you small, Diane. You did that to yourself. Her head whipped toward me, eyes flashing. You shouldn't eavesdrop. You were talking about me. I think that counts as permission, my father sighed. Please, not tonight. Oh, we're doing this tonight, I said. Diane set down the glass and folded her arms. What exactly do you want from us, Clara? You already have success, attention, and power. Is public humiliation part of your brand now? I want acknowledgement, I said evenly. That what you did, how you treated me, was wrong. I treated you just fine, she snapped. You were ungrateful, distant, always acting like we were beneath you. I was a child, I said. You made sure I felt like a guest in my own home. She laughed low and cold. You think you're the only one who suffered? You came in and destroyed the balance we had. Your father was obsessed with making you happy, and I had to hold the rest together. My father finally spoke, his voice low. Diane, that's enough. No, Richard, she said, her tone sharp. She's not innocent in this. She's always played the victim while building her empire on resentment. I stared at her, shocked by how easily she twisted the truth. Resentment built my drive, I said quietly. Not your approval. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rain starting again outside. My father looked between us, his expression torn. I can't do this anymore, he said finally. I've spent years pretending this family works. It doesn't. And that's on me. He turned to Diane. You've controlled every conversation, every relationship in this house. But that ends tonight. She blinked as if she hadn't heard him right. Richard, no, he said firmly. Let me finish. I've watched you belittle my daughter, and I said nothing because silence was easier than confrontation. That was cowardice, and I won't keep doing it. Her voice trembled with disbelief. You're taking her side. I'm taking the truth side, he said. And the truth is, you've been cruel. She looked like he'd struck her. For years she'd ruled this house through control disguised as grace, and now the power was slipping. I could almost see it the moment the illusion cracked. You're making a mistake, she whispered. She'll turn you against everyone just like her mother did. The mention of my mother hit like a spark to dry wood. Don't you dare bring her into this, I said, my voice trembling, my body rigid with unexpected rage. You don't get to use her memory to justify your jealousy. You have no right. Her lips parted, but no words came. My father's shoulders sagged. Enough, he said softly. For the first time in 20 years, the hierarchy of our family shifted. Not through shouting, but through exhaustion, the kind that comes when truth finally outweighs fear. Diane turned away, her control unraveling. I'm going to bed, she said, each word clipped. You can both sit here and wallow in self-righteousness. She disappeared down the hallway, her heels tapping a retreat that sounded almost desperate. The silence that followed was different, heavy but clean. My father poured himself a drink, then one for me. You shouldn't have had to fight that battle, he said. But I did, I replied. And I'll keep doing it until you stop letting her define what family means. He studied the glass in his hand. You think it's too late to change that? I met his eyes. Not if you mean it. We sat on opposite sides of the table, the same table that had hosted decades of polite dinners, now stripped of its pretense. Outside, the rain grew stronger, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. Do you remember when you taught me to sandwood in the garage? I asked suddenly. You said the trick was to go with the grain, not against it, or you'd ruin the surface. He smiled faintly. I remember. You went against the grain with me, I said. For years. He nodded, his expression weary but honest. Then maybe it's time I fix what I ruined. The simplicity of his words undid me. I'd prepared for deflection, denial, excuses. But not this. I swallowed hard. I don't need you to fix me, Dad. I just need you to see me. He set down his glass and reached across the table. I see you now, he said. Too late, maybe. But I do. I placed my hand over his, the contact tentative but real. For the first time, the distance between us felt bridgeable. We stayed there until the clock struck 1, neither of us speaking. The rain softened outside, as if the sky itself had exhaled. When I finally stood to leave, my father said, "Thank you for coming tonight. For staying." I wasn't ready to leave, I admitted. At the door, I glanced back at him. The man standing there wasn't the one who'd mocked me or stayed silent while others did. He looked smaller now, but truer. "Get some sleep," I said. He smiled faintly. "You too, Madam CEO." The title used to feel like armor. Tonight it felt like peace. And as I stepped out into the wet night, I realized this was how real healing begins, not with grand gestures, but with quiet conversations after midnight when the masks finally come off. I woke before sunrise, unsure if it was habit or restlessness that pulled me out of bed. The house was still wrapped in that strange half-light between night and morning. My phone buzzed on the nightstand emails from Singapore, London, and a dozen other time zones that refused to sleep. Normally, I'd answer them instantly. Today, I let them wait. Downstairs, the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air. My father was already in the kitchen wearing the same old flannel robe I remembered from childhood. The sight was almost disorienting ordinary domestic human. "Morning," he said. His voice was rough from too little sleep. "Morning," I replied, taking the mug he handed me. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable, it was new. After years of silence that screamed, this one finally breathed. He leaned against the counter. "Diane left early," he said. "Went to her sister's, said she needed space. That's one way to put it." He gave a tired smile. "I didn't stop her this time. I gave her the keys and told her to take the space she needs. I think that was a first for both of us." I sipped the coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest. "That's probably for the best." He nodded, staring out the window toward the backyard where the Christmas lights still glowed faintly. "It's funny," he said. "I thought peace meant keeping everyone happy. Turns out peace just means telling the truth and letting people decide if they can live with it." We sat at the kitchen table. After a while, he said, "I called Ethan last night after you left. Told him I'm taking a step back from the business." I raised an eyebrow. "You're serious?" "I'm tired," he said. "And he's capable. It's time I learned to just live." I smiled. "You think she'll let go that easily?" He chuckled softly. "Probably not. But that's not my problem anymore." Later that morning, I drove him into town for breakfast at the same diner he'd taken me to as a kid. "You remember this place?" he asked. "I do," I said. "You used to bring me here after Little League practice. I hated baseball. You were terrible at it. But you never quit. Because you told me quitting wasn't an option," I said. "I might have been wrong about that," he admitted. "Sometimes walking away is the bravest thing you can do." Then my father set down his fork and said, "Clara, can I ask you something personal? Are you happy I don't know?" I said honestly. "I think I'm proud. But happy. That's harder." He nodded slowly. "Real success is quieter. It's the mornings when you wake up and don't feel like you're performing." After breakfast, we walked to a small bookstore. He went straight to the classics section and pulled out a worn copy of The Old Man and the Sea. "Your mother loved this one. Said it was about dignity, not fish." He handed it to me. "For you." I traced the faded cover, feeling the roughness of its age and the unexpected weight of the gesture. "You don't have to give me this." "I do," he said softly. "It's the only thing she ever made me promise to pass on." The weight of it hit harder than I expected. I nodded, unable to speak. He smiled. "Guess we both needed this trip." Before I left, he said, "Christmas dinner next week. Just us. No guests, no noise. Think you can handle that?" "Only if I get to cook," I said. He grinned. "Deal." I hugged him goodbye. As I drove away, he looked alive, unburdened. I realized that forgiveness isn't a single moment. It's a series of small choices to listen to, stay to try again. And for the first time since I was a child, I didn't feel like I was driving away from home. I felt like I was driving toward it. The lights along Maple Drive glowed softer this year, almost modestly. No extravagant lawn ornaments, no carolers hired by the Homeowners Association. Just quiet houses and a sky heavy with winter clouds. I parked at the curb in front of my father's home, the same one that had once felt like a stranger's mansion, and for the first time I didn't need to steel myself before walking in. The door opened before I could knock. My father stood there wearing a dark sweater and that shy smile I remembered from childhood. "You're early," he said. "I brought dessert," I replied, holding up a white box. "Apple pie," he guessed. "Mom's recipe," I said. His eyes softened. She'd like that. Inside the house smelled of roasted turkey and cinnamon, not the synthetic perfection of catered food, but the kind that lingered in the air like warmth. The decorations were simple pine garlands, soft white lights, a single star on top of the tree. No towering arrangements or monogrammed napkins. It was as if the house had exhaled its years of pretension. "Ethan's on his way," Dad said, setting down the pie. "He's bringing his girlfriend." "That's new," I said, smiling. "He didn't tell me. He wanted to surprise you." Surprise. That word used to make me flinch. Now it just made me curious. The doorbell rang 20 minutes later. Ethan walked in with a tall brunette who had warm eyes and a quick laugh. "Clara." "This is Mia," he said proudly. "She's a designer." "Not just a designer," Mia added, grinning. "I build furniture from reclaimed wood. Ethan tells me you're the tech genius." "Guilty," I said, shaking her hand. "Nice to finally meet someone who makes real things." Dinner was easy conversation, flowing laughter, natural. My father told stories I hadn't heard in years about the first house he built, about Mom, convincing him to take dance lessons and how terrible he was at it. We all laughed until tears rolled down our faces. Diane's absence was unspoken but felt. The empty chair at the table was a quiet reminder that some gaps never close completely. Yet somehow it didn't hurt. After dessert, we gathered in the living room, exchanging small gifts. I handed my father a wrapped package. "It's not fancy," I said. He opened it carefully, revealing a framed photo, Mom, him and me sitting on the steps of our old blue house, sunlight in our faces. For a long moment, he didn't speak. "I found it in an old box," I explained. "Thought you'd want it back." He nodded slowly, his throat tightening. "I didn't know you still had this." "I didn't either," I said softly, "until I went looking." He reached over, his hand covering mine. "Thank you." Ethan cleared his throat, breaking the emotion gently. "All right, my turn." He handed me a small envelope. Inside was a hand-drawn sketch, our old house, blue shutters and all. "I had Mia draw it," he said. "Figured you might want a piece of home that doesn't fade." I looked up at him, touched in a way I didn't expect. "It's perfect." He shrugged, smiling. "Your family, Clara." It took us too long to say that out loud. A wave of strange relief washed over me, the final weight of our rivalry lifting. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "But we're catching up." Later, as the fire crackled and the others dozed off, I stepped outside onto the porch. The night air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the faint echo of a Christmas song from somewhere down the street. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from an unknown number. I opened it, half expecting some last-minute business alert. Instead, it read, "Merry Christmas, Clara. I'm glad you came back." No name, but I didn't need one. It was from Diane. I stood there for a long time, reading the words again. There was no apology, no attempt to rewrite the past, just a simple acknowledgement. It was enough. Inside, my father appeared at the doorway. "Everything all right?" I turned, slipping the phone back into my coat. "Yeah. Everything's good." He joined me on the porch, the cold air making our breath visible. I was thinking he said about how every Christmas used to feel like a performance. All the lights, the guests, the noise. But tonight, it feels like home again. "It does," I said. He smiled. "You know, for a long time, I thought success meant never looking back. But maybe real success is being able to." I leaned against the railing. "You sound like a philosopher." "Old age," he said, chuckling, "comes with free wisdom." We stood there quietly watching the soft glow of lights from neighboring houses. After a moment, he said, "There's one more thing I need to say. You were right, about everything. About how I hid behind silence, about how I let other people define what mattered. I can't fix all of it, but I can stop pretending." "I think you already have," I said. He looked out at the street. "Do you think it's too late to be a better father?" I shook my head. "No." You just started being one tonight." His hand found mine and we stayed that way, the sound of the wind weaving through the pine trees like an old lullaby. When I finally left that night, the streets were empty except for the glitter of wet pavement and reflections of Christmas lights. I rolled down the window, letting the cold air rush in. For years, I'd built walls to protect myself from this place, from its ghosts, its memories, its people. But now, driving home, I realized something simple and profound: the walls had done their job. They'd kept me safe long enough for me to come back and see things clearly. Not as the wounded daughter, not as the outsider, but as the woman who survived it all and turned it into strength. And somewhere behind me in the house that once held so much silence, my father finally slept without pretending everything was perfect. This Christmas, that was enough. The email came 3 days after Christmas. I was back in my Los Angeles office, buried under end-of-year reports and investor updates, when my assistant Marcy stepped in holding her tablet. "You're not going to believe this," she said, grinning. "You just got invited to give the keynote at the West Coast Business Ethics Forum." I raised an eyebrow. "Business ethics? That's new? They're honoring leaders who've transformed corporate culture. You're top of their list. The theme this year is integrity over image." I laughed softly. "How poetic." Marcy tilted her head. "You're going to accept, right?" I looked at my schedule meetings stacked like dominoes, deadlines waiting to collapse. "Yeah," I said finally. "I think I am." She smiled. "Good. Because the guest list includes half the Fortune 500 and apparently a few members of your family's social circle." I froze a mid-sip of coffee. "What Diane Reynolds RSVP'd," Marcy said, glancing down at her screen. "Apparently she's on the planning committee. Something about community engagement." Of course she was. 2 weeks later, I walked into the Beverly Grand Hotel ballroom, the kind of place where chandeliers looked like they were grown, not hung. The hum of conversation filled the air, polished and practiced. My heels clicked across marble floors that reminded me of every dinner party, every polite insult dressed as concern. But this time I wasn't there as a guest. I was there as the speaker. The coordinator met me backstage, running through logistics. "We'll cue you after the awards," she said. 15-minute slot plus Q&A if time allows. "Got it," I said, adjusting my blazer. I caught sight of myself in the dressing room mirror, black suit. Hair pulled back, expression steady. The reflection looked like someone who belonged here. When I stepped out onto the stage, the applause was polite but curious. They knew my company's numbers, my press quotes, my success. What they didn't know was the story behind it. I began simply. A few years ago, I thought success meant being in rooms like this one, rooms full of polished people who smile for photographs and speak in perfect sound bites. But success built on performance is fragile. It breaks the moment you stop pretending. The crowd quieted. I learned that lesson the hard way. I continued. Not in a boardroom, but at a dinner table. My father once told me that peace means keeping everyone happy. I used to believe him until I realized that kind of peace requires you to disappear. A murmur rippled through the room. I saw faces soften, heads tilt. Even from the stage lights, I could make out Diane sitting in the second row, perfectly still, her expression unreadable. "I built my company on data," I said. But what I really built on was silence, on proving myself to people who refused to see me. The turning point came when I stopped waiting for validation, when I stopped asking for permission to exist at my own table. Applause rose, tentative at first, then fuller. "But here's the truth," I said, leaning forward slightly. "Success doesn't erase pain. It doesn't heal old wounds or rewrite history. What it does, what it can do, is give you the chance to redefine power. Power isn't making people small. It's standing tall without needing to make anyone else shrink." The room erupted in applause. For a moment, the sound felt too big to be real. I took a breath and smiled. "Thank you," I said softly. As I stepped off the stage, the event coordinator handed me a water bottle and whispered, "They loved you." But my attention was already elsewhere. Diane was approaching. She looked different out of the house, less polished, somehow more human. "That was powerful," she said. Thank you, I replied carefully. She hesitated, glancing down at her hands. I wasn't sure I should come, but I needed to hear you say it. You're right, about what power really means. I stayed quiet, unsure where this was going. She looked up, eyes glistening. I was so afraid of being invisible that I made you invisible instead. I can't undo that, but I can say I'm sorry. The words landed like something fragile. Not a performance, not manipulation, just the truth. I nodded slowly. I met her gaze. The calculating look was gone. This was the truth of a tired woman who had finally disarmed herself. That means more than you think, I said. Thank you. She gave a small, tired smile. Richard's happier now. He tells everyone he's retired, but I think he just finally learned how to live. He has, I said. We both did. She studied me for a moment. Maybe there's hope for me too. Maybe there is, I said gently. She touched my arm lightly, then turned and walked away before I could respond. That evening, after the event ended, I sat alone on the hotel balcony, the city glowing beneath me. The applause still echoed faintly in my ears, but what lingered louder was her voice. I'm sorry. 2 words I'd waited decades to hear, and somehow they didn't undo the past, but they softened it. My phone buzzed. A message from Dad. Watch the live stream. You made me proud, kiddo. I smiled, staring out at the skyline. I thought of the feeling of belonging that success finally granted. Thanks, Dad, I whispered to no one. My own front door was stronger than any they could offer. As I packed my things and headed for the elevator, I passed by the empty ballroom. The chandeliers were dimmed now, the chairs half stacked. But on the stage, my name still glowed in white letters across the screen. Clara Reynolds, CEO of Raintech. For years, that title had been armor. Tonight it was true. I paused, took one last look at the silent room, and whispered the same words my mother used to say every Christmas before bed, words that meant both closure and beginning. Be kind, even when it's hard. Then I turned off the lights and walked out, not as the daughter who once waited for approval, but as the woman who had finally learned to forgive and to lead without needing to be seen. It was nearly midnight when the phone rang. I was reviewing contract drafts at home, half listening to the hum of the city outside my window, when I saw my father's name on the screen. He never called that late. Dad? I answered quickly. Hey, kiddo, he said, his voice hoarse but steady. Sorry if I woke you. I set my laptop aside. It's fine. What's going on? There was a pause. It's Diane, he said finally. She's moving out. She said she needs to figure out who she is without all the appearances. I told her I need the same thing. And how do you feel, I asked? He sighed, long and slow. Relieved. Sad. Free, maybe. I'm not sure yet. That's a good mix, though. Means it's real. We talked a few minutes longer, small things, soft things. When we hung up, I sat in the quiet for a long time. For years, the word home had meant something complicated, something bruised. But lately, it had started to sound less like a place and more like a possibility. 2 weeks later, I found myself driving through Maplewood again. My father met me at the door, looking healthier than I'd seen him in years. The house feels different, I said as I stepped inside. He nodded. Quieter? Lighter? We spent the morning cleaning out the attic. We opened boxes of yellowed newspapers and broken ornaments. Somewhere near the bottom, I found a stack of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. What's this? I asked. He glanced over, eyes softening. Those are the letters your mom wrote me when we were dating. I kept every one. I ran my fingers over the paper. You were brave. He smiled. No, just in love. I placed the letters gently back in the box. You should keep them somewhere safe. Later that afternoon, we took a walk through town. We sat on a bench outside a bakery. The owner, an old friend, handed me a pastry box. Your dad already paid for these. Said you liked the apple turnovers. Some traditions are worth keeping, he murmured. I've been thinking about something, he said suddenly. I want to sell the construction company. I froze. Really? Yeah, he said. Ethan's been doing great on his own. Me? I'm done chasing contracts. I want to build something smaller, something that lasts. Your mom always talked about opening a community center. Maybe I'll finally do that. Call it Mason Place, after her maiden name. I felt a tightness in my throat. That was his ultimate act of devotion, a true tribute to Mom. She'd love that I said, my voice thick with unexpected emotion. He smiled. You'd help me set it up. Of course, I said. You won't be able to keep me away. That evening, as the sun dipped low, my father joined me in the backyard, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. I don't think I ever told you, he said, how much I admired you for leaving. I thought you were running away, but really you were running toward something. I took a sip of coffee. I wasn't brave back then, Dad. I was just tired. Maybe, he said, but you turned that tiredness into something beautiful. That's brave. I'm proud of you, Clara, he said. Not just for the company, but for finding your way back. Thanks, Dad, I said softly. I'm proud of you too. He chuckled. We're quite the late bloomers, huh? He nodded, sipping his coffee. You know, this is the first time in years I feel like I'm living my own life again. I think I'll start tomorrow with blue paint for the shutters. I laughed. Now that's a project I can get behind. We clinked our mugs together, the steam rising between us like a quiet promise. That night, as I drove back to my hotel, I thought about the letters in the attic and the way his voice had softened when he said her name. Maybe healing wasn't about forgetting the pain. Maybe it was about learning to carry it without breaking. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't carrying it alone anymore. The paint smell hit me the moment I stepped out of the car. It was sharp and fresh, layered over the scent of sawdust and winter air. My father was standing on a ladder, paintbrush in hand, dabbing a careful line along a bright blue shutter. The color was exactly right, the same deep shade that once framed the windows of our childhood home. He turned when he heard my footsteps, grinning like a man half his age. It's not perfect, he said, but it's ours. I stood at the end of the driveway for a moment, just watching him. The winter sunlight bounced off the new paint, the air full of quiet activity, like a heartbeat restored. It's perfect, I said finally. He climbed down and handed me a brush. You want to help? I've got 3 more shutters that could use your touch. I smiled. You're really putting me to work, huh? Call it family therapy, he said with a wink. We painted in silence for a while, the rhythm almost meditative. When we finished, he stepped back, studying the house. Looks better already, he said. Like it's breathing again. Like we are, I replied. He nodded slowly, his eyes distant but peaceful. You know, when your mother first picked this color, I hated it. I thought it was too loud. But she said blue made her feel like the world was wider than it seemed. I smiled. She was right. She usually was, he said with a small laugh. Inside the house was mid-renovation boxes stacked in corners, furniture draped with plastic sheets. But it didn't feel chaotic. It felt alive. The blueprint for the new community center was spread across the dining table, his handwriting scrawled in the margins. You've been busy, I said, flipping through the plans. He shrugged. Ethan's helping with the design. He's talking to the city council next week about permits. That's amazing, I said. You're really doing it. He looked up, meeting my eyes. We are, he said softly. You started this, Clara. You showed me what it means to build something that matters. The words caught me off guard. For years I'd wanted him to recognize my worth, but now that he did, it wasn't validation, it was connection. Maybe, I said. But this is your legacy. He smiled. Maybe it's both of ours. That afternoon, Ethan arrived with Mia. They brought sandwiches, blueprints, and a burst of warmth that filled the house. We sat around the dining table, papers and coffee cups everywhere. Mia pointed to one of the designs. If we expand this section, we could include a tech lab for local students, coding, robotics, that kind of thing. That's perfect, I said. I can help with the equipment. Ethan grinned. You'd better. I already told the town council my sister's company was sponsoring it, always volunteering me for things I teased. Family tradition, he shot back, his eyes twinkling. Good thing you became CEO, or I'd have to do it all myself. It was no longer competition, but collaboration, and I felt a strange, quiet relief. Dad laughed, leaning back in his chair. You two sound just like you did when you were kids. Except now, it's about tech labs instead of toy trains. Progress? Ethan said, raising his coffee cup. To progress, Dad echoed, clinking his cup against ours. Later that evening, after they'd left, I found myself alone in the living room. The house was quiet, except for the steady hum of the heater. On the mantel sat a framed photo Mom, Dad, and me taken just before she got sick. I traced my fingers along the frame, the glass cool beneath my touch. You'd like this, I whispered. You'd like what he's doing. I didn't hear him come in, but Dad's voice was soft behind me. She would, he said. You know, I think she's been guiding us back to this all along. I turned. You think she'd be proud of us? He smiled. I think she already was. We stood there for a while. The silence between us no longer heavy, just full. The next morning I woke early and found him sitting at the kitchen table, coffee steaming beside an open notebook. You're up early, I said. He looked up, smiling. Couldn't sleep. I've been making a list of what people I need to thank, people I need to apologize to. I sat across from him. That's a long list, he chuckled. Longer than I'd like to admit. But it feels good, you know. Like cleaning out a closet that's been shut too long. He tore a page from the notebook and handed it to me. My name was at the top. You're first, he said. Dad. He held up a hand. Let me say it. I spent too many years pretending that peace meant silence, that love meant compromise. But what I really did was avoid the truth. You paid the price for that. And I'm sorry. The words landed deep, quiet, and true. I forgave you a long time ago, I said. He nodded. I know. But I needed to say it anyway. I reached across the table and took his hand. Thank you. He smiled, and for a second, I saw the man I remembered from childhood, the one who built things not because they made money, but because they made people's lives better. That afternoon, we drove out to the old lake where he used to take me fishing. The water was frozen now, smooth and silver under the pale sun. Mom used to bring hot chocolate, I said, looking out across the ice. She'd sit on that rock and pretend to read while she kept an eye on us. He chuckled. She never fooled anyone. She was terrified you'd fall in. I almost did once. I remember he said, I grabbed you by the jacket. You cried for an hour, said the fish were laughing at you. I laughed softly. I was a dramatic kid. You still are, he teased. We sat there in companionable silence. After a while he said, You know, when she died, I thought the best way to honor her was to keep everything running smoothly. No fights, no disruptions. But that wasn't honoring her, it was burying her spirit. She wouldn't have wanted that, I said. No, he agreed. She would have wanted us to live. Fully. Messily. Honestly. The wind picked up scattering bits of snow across the frozen surface. He stood brushing off his gloves. Come on. Let's get home. I've got one more coat of paint to finish. As we walked back to the truck, I glanced over my shoulder at the lake, still beautiful, unbroken. For years it had symbolized loss. Now it feels like a memory, something you carry, not something that drowns you. That night after dinner, Dad handed me a small box. It's not much, he said. Just something I found while we were cleaning. Inside was a silver locket, my mother's. Inside 2 tiny photos, one of her, one of me as a child. I think it's yours now, he said. I closed it carefully and held it to my chest, inhaling deeply. I felt the cool weight of the metal and a surge of profound connection. This was the final quiet confirmation of my identity and my rightful place. Thank you, I whispered. He smiled. For what it's worth, Clara, I think she's been waiting for this moment for a long time. So have I whispered. Outside, the wind howled softly through the new blue shutters, and for the first time in decades, the house felt whole again. The grand opening of Mason Place took place on a bright Saturday morning in early spring. The air smelled of fresh paint and blooming jasmine, the kind that seemed to announce a beginning. A small crowd had gathered outside the building, neighbors, city, officials, students, and families. The community center, once a blueprint on my father's dining table, now stood proudly with its freshly painted blue shutters gleaming under the California sun. Dad stood beside me, dressed in a navy jacket, his tie slightly crooked. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You earned it," I said. He smiled. "We earned it." Ethan was setting up a microphone near the entrance, Mia organizing volunteers by the registration table. A banner fluttered across the front that read, "Mason Place, Building Futures, Honoring the Past." The mayor stepped up first to give her short, polite speech, full of civic pride and optimism. But when she finished and motioned for my father to speak, he turned to me instead. "This is your moment," he said quietly. "Dad, it's your project." He shook his head. "It's our legacy. You tell them why it matters." So I did. I stepped up to the microphone, the sunlight warm on my face, and looked at the sea of expectant faces. When I was a kid, my parents taught me that hard work builds more than houses, it builds people. What I've learned is that it means nothing unless you bring others with you. I gestured toward the building behind me. This center isn't just a building. It's a promise to our kids, to our community, to every person who's ever been told they don't belong at the table. This is where we remind them they do. Applause rippled through the crowd, soft at first, then swelling like a tide. I caught sight of my father, clapping eyes, glistening pride radiating from him like sunlight. When the ribbon was finally cut, the crowd poured inside. The main hall was bright and filled with laughter. Local artists displaying work, students setting up computers in the new tech lab, volunteers giving tours. Mason Place already felt alive, exactly as my mother would have wanted. Later that afternoon, when the crowd thinned, I found a quiet moment in the garden courtyard. My father joined me carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Not bad for our first day," he said. "Not bad at all," I agreed. We sat on the bench beneath the oak tree. "You know," he said, "I used to think redemption was some big dramatic thing. Turns out it's just small choices every day to be better." I nodded. "You've made a lot of those lately." Footsteps approached behind me. I turned to see Diane standing in the doorway. She looked different. Simpler clothes. No makeup. Her posture, no longer perfect, just real. "I didn't think you'd come," I said. "I wasn't sure I should," she admitted. "But I wanted to see it for myself." She looked around the bright, neat halls. "It's beautiful," she said. "Your mother would be proud." "Thank you," I said softly. She hesitated. "I talked to your father a few weeks ago. We've been civil. Honest for once. I think that's as close to peace as we'll ever get." She nodded, eyes glistening. "You were right about me. I was so afraid of being forgotten that I hurt people who deserved better. I can't undo it, but I can own it." I looked into her eyes. The calculating look was gone. This was the truth of a tired woman who had finally surrendered. "That's a start," I said. "It's exactly what you deserve, another chance." She blinked hard, then nodded, turning to leave. "Goodbye, Clara. Goodbye, Diane." When I finally stepped outside, the sky had turned deep indigo. The lights of Mason Place glowed behind me, a beacon in the dusk. My father was waiting near the parking lot. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Better than okay." I looked across the courtyard where Ethan and Mia were laughing as they locked the main doors. I realized that though we had different pasts, we had chosen the same future. This collaboration felt like the final family healing. "Next year," he said, "I was thinking maybe we will host a Christmas dinner here." I laughed softly. "You sure you want to risk another family dinner?" He chuckled. "Only if you promise to sit at the head of the table." I grinned. "Deal." Back in Los Angeles a week later, I found myself sitting at my office window. Marcy stepped in holding a report. "Quarterly numbers are in," she said. "We're up 12%. Again. I smiled. "Good. But make sure we bump the Mason Place fund this quarter. I want more kids in that program by summer." When she left, I turned back to the window. The sun was setting over the city. That night before I left the office, I recorded a short message for our company's social media. "If there's one thing I've learned," I said into the camera, It's that success isn't about what door you walk through. It's about what you build once you're inside. Sometimes the back door leads to the brightest room. I pause, smiling. So if you've ever been underestimated, excluded, or told you don't belong, remember your worth doesn't need validation. It's an asset. We want you at our table. Come and build with us. I stopped recording, uploaded the clip, and turned off the lights. As I stepped into the night, I whispered, "Here's to second chances." And for the first time in my life, I didn't look back.